All right, so away from the industrial action, the Academic Staff Union of Universities says the federal government's plan to automatically deduct 40% from universities' internally generated revenue will impoverish the university system. In October, the Ministry of Finance notified academic institutions across the country of its plan to automatically deduct 40% from their IGR. ASUU, in a statement signed by its national president, Professor Emmanuel Osodeke, after its National Executive Council meeting at the Kaduna State University in Kaduna, explained that universities were not revenue-generating agencies, saying that the obligatory fees paid by students were to provide the necessary tools for them to be properly educated. Osodeke advised the federal government to remove universities from the list of agencies expected to remit 40% from its IGR. To further discuss this, I'm being joined by a business, political and social policy analyst, Kenneth Ikenwa. Good afternoon, Kenneth, and thank you so much for joining me on the news.
Good afternoon, Dushan. Thanks for having me on once again.
All right, so what does the finance circular say about the policy of 40% auto deduction of gross IGR, and what do you make of the inclusion of universities in this particular policy?
All right, I read through that policy and I find it as a precedent. It's an interesting time in the history of university education in Nigeria, but I'll go straight to the point. Now, let me start by saying categorically, I'm not speaking on behalf of ASUU. I'm not engaged or asked to do that. But I'm speaking as a stakeholder, as a service provider in the Nigerian university system for almost 20 years, and also as an intermediate customer in and of the Nigerian university system. So my experiences are valid, and I would try to be as unbiased as possible. Now, the Nigerian university system, tertiary system, has been a little bit unstable. Whether you look at the universities or you look at the polytechnics in the last couple of 2 to 3 years, let's say 5. But Nigeria's democracy has been fairly stable. Now, the salaries that those in the executive and those in the legislature across all levels, the federal and the state, has been stable. But the salaries and the subsidies granted to federal universities and state universities have not been stable. These are contradictions. The last contradiction is that those that are members of the executive and those in the legislature over the last 5 years, 90%, I can't say, I want to hypothesize, have their children studying abroad. So they may not understand the intricacies of having people school in Nigeria and the rots and the underfunding and the disservice that is done to the Nigerian tertiary education sector. That said, now let's address the major issues that these contradictions bring to the fore. Now, a couple of years ago, I think about last year during the campaign season, I did hear the present president of the Federal Republic promise that there will be students' loans, and secondly, that universities will be granted autonomy. Now, the autonomy I will call tertiary institutions sovereignty. If you had hitherto promised universities autonomy, how do you now turn around to say that from whatever revenue they generate in terms of IGR, you are now mandating them to remit 40% back to the federal government? I think this is a major contradiction, and I think that we are preparing the system to be heated up and preparing it to bring us into a state of social anarchy. I do not think it is a call in the right time, at the right time, and I think the government could have done better than that, considering the instability that the tertiary educational sector in Nigeria has witnessed in the last 5 years. This is one order, this is one expectation out of place.
All right, Kenneth. Now, some of the unions in tertiary institutions have actually rejected this policy outrightly, saying that their schools will not survive any of the deductions, with many of them also threatening to embark on a strike. Now, can you tell us what adverse effects will this policy have on higher institutions should they remain on the list?
All right. Federal tertiary institutions and also state institutions actually survive on government subsidies and subventions. Now, most of these subsidies are used to finance operating expenditure across universities. And other expenditure like, sponsoring academics for conferences, for research, for development, and for maintaining infrastructure on various campuses. Now, the addition that universities and other tertiary institutions get from internally generated revenue just add, all right, to ensure that these structures, this infrastructure keep going, because what you get from the government is not even enough to keep the university system and infrastructure running. I'll give you an example of my university. And again, I'm not authorized to speak on behalf of my university. I am aware that my institution expends in the tune of about 2 billion a year on energy alone. That brings us to an average for electricity in the university. Now, how do we fund that when what we get from the government on a monthly basis is just well over 100 million? There is a deviation here, and this will lead, of course, to a lacuna or a lag in finances for maintaining infrastructure. Now, universities have to embark on research, academics have to go on conferences, and all of these conferences have a soft effect on promoting the image of Nigeria and the image of these Nigerian institutions abroad. If we do not generate monies internally to be able to fund this, how do we, considering the devaluation of even the Naira, how do we send our professors and send our young academicians abroad to go on conferences and to go on exchange programs? These are some of the areas. Now, the student hostels have to be maintained. Granted, increases in increment in fees of these hostels have come at unprecedented rate, but these are some of the channels and other channels that I can't even begin to mention here that internally generated revenue actually are expended. And the government will do better than this, instead of asking that universities and other tertiary institutions should now start remitting 40%. I think it is wrong, and I make bold to say that what this is going to create may end up in a legal circle, and we may promote the agenda of saying that this is quite illegitimate. Not at this time. It has no legitimacy in law.
All right, Kenneth, you did talk about the lack of finances, in some of these tertiary institutions. But let's come back to the parents right now, looking at the state of the economy. What will be the fate of parents if they fail to, or if they're unable to fund their wards' tuitions? Because some of these colleges and also universities have actually said that rather than taking it from their IGR, they would pass the burden to the parents and, end up increasing the school fees.
Yet again, that is another contradiction. In fact, a very strategic contradiction. Now, when we talk about generating revenue, we'll also look at taxation, because this is a contradiction with respect to what this present administration is claiming to be a purveyor of, which is to reduce multiple taxation. Now, let me remind you, Dushan, that there is a law in this country that makes it mandatory for companies in Nigeria to pay, I think, about 5% of their tax and contribute that to what you call the Tertiary Education Tax Fund. What are those monies being used for? Now, if monies like that have been generated, which are in the excess of trillions from corporate organizations, why would you now want to pass across again, directly or indirectly, the burden of taxation to some of these parents that work in some of these companies, by the way of now taxing the university revenue and making those universities or making those institutions to pass those taxes indirectly to the parents? What burden are we removing from the heads of Nigerians? What burden are we actually removing from the burden that Nigerian parents and over 160 million Nigerians have to bear with the removal of subsidy in Nigeria? I do not think the government is being sincere in playing its role of subsidiarity in the Nigerian in Nigeria today, and we must address that. And the advisors of this government must take a look at these policies and rejig these policies and ensure that
that they are people-friendly and these policies are actually Pareto optimal and promote social efficiency. This is the most inefficient policy I have heard this government, spill out from whatever quarters, and I hope that they do something quickly to reverse it. There are better things that can be done with 40% from the revenue of
all right,
Kenneth,
that was a very interesting question you raised earlier, but sadly would have to wrap up here. Very interesting conversation indeed. Thank you so much for joining me on the news to discuss this particular issue. We hope to have you some other time.
Thank you, Dushan. Nice being with you.